Strawson's argument that we couldn't give up the reactive attitudes. He also makes a related argument that we wouldn't give up reactive attitudes. So if it turns out, we could in fact, find out ways to give up these attitudes. Either we develop our characters, or we take drugs that neuroscientists develop that help us, stop being angry with people all the time. Strawson thinks that we wouldn't actually want to do that. He thinks that the reactive attitudes are actually really, really important. I mentioned this briefly in the last lecture. Strawson thinks that our relationships really depend on these kind of intense angry attitudes, these intense emotional, being really grateful, feeling great admiration, being really angry or resentful, and indignant, contempt, giving and loving, trusting and everything. He thinks relationships are really dependent on these kinds of things. And if we were to give up those attitudes, we'd lose something of great importance, namely these relationships. So he thinks that, even given the magic power to give up the reactive attitudes, we wouldn't want to give them up. We would prefer our relationships. Importantly here, speaks to an important part of his motivation here, I think, is that he thinks that people have focused too much on these metaphysical issues at the expense of, commonalities or commonplaces about personal relationships. And here you think of him as saying, look, our relationships with others are much more important than any abstract theory. A theory that then comes and says that you shouldn't have personal relationships with people of the kind of value and importance that we have now. It's not a theory you should accept. We have practical reason not to do it. We will value and like these relationships. And you could extend this to see it as being part of our conception of ourselves. Just in general, like we conceive of ourselves as people who have these relationships and who express and manifest ill will and who respond to the ill will and goodwill of others with reactive attitudes. That's very important because that's what constitutes friendship and love, or at least things related to those important issues. And we're just not going to give that up for anything. We're not going to give it up because some incompatibilist comes along and says, free will is incompatible with determinism, and their scientist friend comes along and says determinism is true. He's like, I'm not going to listen to that. I actually think these things are important. I don't care what your theories tell me. This is what's important. So in a way here, this is directly challenging skeptics, to some extent incompatibilists, about free will and moral responsibility. Strawson thinks that we just wouldn't want to live without personal relationships. And maybe a stronger claim is that we cannot, like our lives would be so impoverished that we won't want to live without these personal relationships. Of course, here on the other side, you can see people like Peereboom and others as kind of at least implicitly responding to Strawsonian points. They want to say, okay, I see that you think that personal relationships are very important. We agree. But we also think there are certain facts about reality that mean that we're not justified in certain aspects of these relationships. And indeed, Peereboom and others also think that there are moral reasons that we shouldn't get angry with each other. Peereboom thinks it's actually more damaging to personal relationships than good for personal relationships to be really angry with each other. I mean, of course, you've got the free will skeptic, hard incompatibilist, and hard determinist conceding that we're going to lose stuff of importance. So Strawson could here and respond here and say, look, skeptics aren't getting everything that's important. Let's just ignore them and let's focus on what's important to us. There's still a lot of debate to be had here. And I think it's interesting to think about which view you find more plausible. Do you think you prioritize your personal relationships, or do you think you prioritize alleged metaphysical or moral facts? Of course, Strawson here might be seen as also challenging the moral facts that Peereboom claims there are, because Strawson's going to say, look, there can be damage to relationships from anger, but the risk of that damage is what makes the relationship so important. What makes it so valuable when you're in a personal relationship? What makes that relationship so valuable is that if you fail that person, if you hurt that person, if you betray that person, they're going to be livid with you. They're going to be angry. They're not going to want to have the relationship anymore. And it's that risk of that damage that makes the relationship so valuable. Because when it works and you have that trust between people, despite the risk of all these horrible things happening, like betrayal and so on, you get this really, really valuable relationship, according to Strawson. So let's now turn to what people call the reversal thesis. I want to be clear here that Strawson isn't explicit about the reversal thesis. He never makes that term, he never uses that term. But his interpreters and his defenders have seen this in stuff that he says. So one thing he does talk about is our practices not requiring external justification. So he thinks that we have our practices and they justify themselves internally. We don't need some external justification. What he means by this is we don't need to appeal to any sort of metaphysical facts to then tell us that we should have reactive attitudes towards others. We have our practice and everything, all those attitudes are justified internally to them. So one way to think of this is that the sort of traditional way of thinking about our actual practices is that they're supposed to reflect underlying facts. People put this in terms of conceptual priority. So the thought here is that facts about being morally responsible, including facts about acting freely, are conceptually prior to facts about holding responsible. So when we hold somebody responsible, this presupposes that we're meeting certain facts about being morally responsible. If I get angry at you for betraying me, this presupposes that you're morally responsible for betraying me, that you've met the independent facts that say you're morally responsible for betrayal. Me holding you responsible, kind of speaking to those facts. Those facts come first, and I'm kind of, in a way, responding to them when I engage in the reactive attitudes towards your betrayal of me. So, like I say in the slides, this is a fancy way of expressing that when we hold people responsible, we do so because there's some independent fact about the situation. So I like this kind of metaphor. Imagine we've got a big book of facts. So when God creates the universe, you don't have to be a theist to agree with, to see the metaphor here, but I think it's fairly illustrative. So imagine you've got God. He's created the world. He's got his big book of facts. He's like, oh, right, I'm going to make what are the conditions on being morally responsible? He's got his page, moral responsibility conditions, and he writes in, you have to act freely, you have to meet, either compatibilist libertarian conditions, you have to meet relevant epistemic conditions, and he writes that in his big book of facts, where all the facts are out. So the idea here is that those facts about being morally responsible kind of exist independently of our practices. So if you're a theist, you might really believe that God has a big book of facts, or that the facts exist somewhere else. If you don't believe in God, the facts just exist somewhere in the universe. They're just, in the same way that moral facts might exist separate to humans, facts about the conditions of moral responsibility also. So again, the thought is, when I'm holding you responsible for betraying me or holding you responsible for any other act, I'm sort of, if my instance of holding responsible, being angry, of demanding an apology or an explanation is appropriate, then it will speak to whatever is in the big book of facts on the moral responsibility page. So Strawson, on the other hand, is like, at least when it comes to moral responsibility facts, there's no moral responsibility facts in it. There's no moral responsibility facts in the big book of facts. So the big book of facts might have other facts about life. Strawson, I don't think, is saying anything about the nature of facts or everything depending on human perception or anything like that. But he does think that the human practice of holding people responsible is not sensitive to these separate, independent facts. They're just dependent on our actual practice of holding each other responsible. So if you take the kind of independence view, where you take the view that being morally responsible is conceptually prior to holding moral responsibility, that we're always speaking to the big book of facts, we could be getting everything wrong, right? We could have just mistaken what the conditions of moral responsibility are. Humans are limited. We might just completely confused. Compatibilist, libertarian, other conditions might be completely wrong, right? Because those facts just exist independently of them. They're in the big book of facts, if you want to follow that metaphor for longer. But Strawson here is saying, look, we can't be that wrong. Like, holding people responsible, having the reactive attitudes is a human practice. It's one that involves humans, one that we're actively engaged in, one that we're actively invested in because of the value of our relationships. And it's ones that we can't get completely wrong like that. We can't get completely wrong because actually facts about holding responsible are conceptually prior to facts about being responsible. So it's not the case that when we hold somebody responsible that we're, in effect, trying to get what's right in the big book of facts. What we're doing is that the conditions of being responsible are written or determined as a result of holding responsible. So it's not of particular instances of holding responsible, but the entire practice. So whether a person has met the conditions of being responsible is dependent on the practice, the real human practice of holding people responsible. It's that practice that determines the conditions of being morally responsible. So when we think of like a condition of being responsible, like acting freely or knowing what you're doing or expressing your will, if that's a genuine condition of holding people responsible, it's something that comes out of our practice as a result of the human practice of holding people responsible. It's not some independent fact that our practice is trying to get right. Rather, the practice is there, it exists, and then the conditions on being responsible, on acting freely, are a result of that practice. So as a result, if you think acting freely is a condition on being responsible, and the practice is also going to determine what it means for you to act of your own free will, for you to act freely. That's not going to be determined by some independent fact, such as a fact in the big book of facts. It's just going to be a fact that's the result or determined or follows from our actual practices. Now, this is a radical departure from other theories, right? So Strawson, if this is really what's in Strawson, and I think it's a plausible understanding of what's in Strawson and what a key part of his view is, this is very different to most other theories. So most other theories will take the view that there are independent facts about what it means to be responsible. Our practices are trying to get those facts right. And when we theorize about what the conditions on responsibility are, and this is what I think everyone in the compatibilist lecture, the libertarian lecture, I think all those views are understood in this sort of way of trying to figure out what the independent conditions are, or at least they're compatible with that. And I think it's often just a presupposition of all these debates that we're trying to figure out what the independent facts of the matter are through thought experiments, through thinking about cases, so on. Strawson, on the other hand, is like, that's one of the reasons you've got everything so wrong. You focused on the metaphysical or these other theoretical abstract issues at the expense of actually being in the relationships, actually looking at what's important, and then looking at that practice. So there's way more to say about Strawson, and there's way more controversies, way more different understandings, and things to think about. Many Strawsonians don't accept reversal thesis. So John Fisher and Marta Visa, their 1998 book, Responsibility and Control, claim to be Strawsonians, but they don't accept this. They actually accept the sort of traditional view and work within that, but they accept other aspects of the Strawsonian picture. And that's often what you'll find is that people accept aspects of Strawson's view, but not everything. And so you get a very confusing, I'm still very confused really when I hear people say they're Strawsonians, because it can mean so many different things. In any case, I'll leave it there for the positive arguments. We're now quickly look at like how Strawson would respond to the basic argument. I hope that this has been fairly clear from what I've said already. So Strawson would be rejecting premise 2 here. So Strawson Senior, not to be confused, Strawson Senior would be rejecting his son, Galen Strawson's argument on the basis of premise 2. So Galen Strawson's basic argument talks about true moral responsibility. Now this seems to really work with the traditional view that there are independent facts about what the conditions of moral responsibility are, what moral responsibility is. Strawson the Senior Sir Peter Strawson, he just rejects that. I think he's going to reject that and say, like, you're completely mistaken what is important to us. And what is important to us is our actual human relationship, being engaged with others, being participants in the moral community. This whole argument speaks to something else. Really, he's just going to deny that moral responsibility is anything so extravagant. It's like, no, it's about, attitudes we have towards people, and other practices build on those attitudes, but ultimately it's about our personal relationships and about our attitudes towards others. Strawson does have, in some ways, it's quite easy to be compelled by Strawson's view. Once you've read Freedom and Resentment enough, I worry that people get a kind of Stockholm syndrome, and I've had it myself, where you think you've read it so many times, you think this must be a work of genius. And there is a lot of important stuff in Strawson's. There's a good reason why it's so influential. And I think it's definitely worth reading multiple times, closely studying, reading secondary texts, trying to come up with your own view on it, and trying to really figure out the arguments in it. But Strawson's view has a number of problems, right? There's a lot. We've mentioned a few, and maybe also alluded maybe to this one a little bit. But one of the big problems for Strawson is that he can't really explain moral progress. So one time or another, humans also didn't just engage in ritual sacrifice, they also blamed animals. There are apparently cases of, in like England and Europe in the Middle Ages, horses going on trial, things like this. They're being explicitly held responsible. And so at one point or another, we engaged in these reactive attitudes with animals, and then we punished them as a result of thinking that they were appropriate target. And we don't think that anymore. We think we've progressed. But how then do we explain this moral progress? So if you take the view that there are independent moral facts, you can say, look, when we've made moral progress, we've just got a better view of what the actual conditions on being morally responsible are. We've discovered that animals are not morally responsible because we've got closer to what the actual facts are, or maybe even got the facts right. But since Strawson has this reversal thesis, and he puts the facts about being responsible as a sort of result, or determined by our practices of holding responsible, it's not clear how he avoids a kind of implausible result here. Presume he doesn't want to accept that animals could be appropriate targets of the reactive attitudes, at least not to the extent that humans are. But yeah, it's not clear how he would make sense of that. Of course, it's not a part of our actual practices now, but it was part of our actual practices back then. And the non-Strawsonian, the person who rejects the reversal thesis, has a very easy way of explaining this. Strawson, not so easy. So I'm going to leave it there. Again, there are other problems for Strawson. A lot has been written about Strawson. A lot of people interpreting Strawson in various different ways. A lot of people objecting to Strawson in various ways. A lot of people appealing to aspects of Strawson's view. There's a lot. Again, I think it's really worth close study. Freedom and Resentment as a paper is a classic for a reason. It's difficult and dense, but it really is worth reading, trying to get to grips with. I don't know if there'll ever be a point where we've fully worked out what's going on in that paper. But in a way, that's why it's such a classic paper. Even with that in mind, don't write like Strawson in your essays. Please, do yourself a favor. Try and be as clear as possible. Answer the question. Enjoy. I'll see you again for the next, I'm going to record the collaborative class, which will be on the lectures 4 and 5, Living Without Free Will, and then I'll be back as your lecturer for Am I Part of Something Bigger Than Me? So I look forward to seeing you all then.